In the shadow of Jonathan Brandis's tragedy, one question has always lingered. Could anyone have saved him? Many eyes turned to Roy Scheider, the captain, the mentor, and perhaps the only steadfast anchor Brandis had on the set of SeaQuest DSV. But in a cruel twist of fate, that guide could not win the battle against his own destiny. He was Roy Scheider, the legend from Jaws, a man who witnessed the young star he mentored extinguish in despair, only to then quietly depart himself after a brutal battle with illness. His story is not just one of Hollywood glamour, but a painful meditation on a haunting question. What happens when the mentor, the one person who might have been a lifeline, is also powerless against fate? Roy Scheider was born on a cold November day, the 10th of the month in 1932, in Orange, New Jersey. This was an America gripped by the Great Depression, a time of profound and pervasive hardship that forged a generation defined by resilience, pragmatism, and a no-nonsense approach to survival. The optimism of the Roaring Twenties had evaporated, replaced by breadlines, dust bowls, and a gnawing uncertainty that permeated every aspect of life. In Orange, a city just west of Newark, the signs were everywhere. Shuttered factories, men in worn suits selling apples on street corners, and a pervasive sense of anxiety that clung to the air like the industrial smog. It was into this world of diminished expectations and hardened resolve that Roy was born. His family was a microcosm of the American melting pot, a blend of disciplines and temperaments that would deeply embed itself in their son's character. His father, Roy Bernhard Scheider, was a proud German-American and a skilled auto mechanic. He was a man who understood the world through tangible logic, through the precise interplay of engines, gears, and pistons. His hands, calloused and stained with grease, were the hands of a man who solved problems, who brought order to chaos through methodical work. He was a Protestant, embodying a certain stoicism and a belief in the virtues of hard work and self-reliance. His mother, Anna Crossan, was his father's opposite in many ways. An Irish-American and a devout Catholic, she brought a different kind of fire and faith into the household, a spirit infused with stories with a sense of life's poetry and tragedy, and an emotional warmth that balanced her husband's reserved nature. This combination of stoic German pragmatism and passionate Irish soul created a home of stark contrasts. It was a household where discipline was paramount, but where love was deeply felt, a place where you were expected to fix what was broken, but also to pray for what was beyond your control. This duality, the practical and the poetic, the head and the heart, would become the foundational conflict within young Roy, a tension he would spend a lifetime exploring, both in his life and through his craft. Young Roy was not the tough, imposing figure he would one day portray on screen. He was a small, frail, and often sickly child, an easy target for the assorted illnesses that swept through neighborhoods in the pre-antibiotic era. His childhood was shadowed by a particularly severe bout of rheumatic fever at the age of 6. In the late 1930s, this was a terrifying diagnosis, a complication of untreated strep throat. Rheumatic fever was an inflammatory disease that could wreak havoc on the body, attacking the joints, the brain, and most frighteningly, the heart. It left countless children with permanently damaged heart valves, a lifelong sentence of physical limitation, and the constant threat of heart failure. For an extended, terrifying period, Roy was confined to his bed. His world shrank to the four walls of his room. The sounds of other children playing outside, the crack of a baseball bat, the shouts of a game of tag, became a painful reminder of a life he couldn't participate in. His body was fragile, his heart weakened, and his childhood was effectively put on hold. This period of forced solitude had a profound effect on his developing psyche. While other boys were learning about the world through physical interaction and competition, Roy became an observer. He retreated into the solitary worlds of books and radio dramas, his imagination becoming his primary playground. He developed a thoughtful, serious disposition, the quiet intensity of a child who has become intimately familiar with his own vulnerability. The shadow of his illness hung over the family, a constant source of worry for his parents who saw their energetic son reduced to a fragile invalid. But Roy Bernhard Scheider, the stoic mechanic, refused to let illness define his son's future. He was a man who believed in action, not acquiescence. While the conventional medical wisdom of the day often prescribed a lifetime of cautious rest for rheumatic fever survivors, Roy's parents received a radical, almost counterintuitive prescription from their doctors: physical activity. The theory, bold for its time, was that the heart was a muscle like any other, and that it could, with careful and deliberate training, be strengthened. They were advised not just to encourage Roy to play, but to train him to fight. It was a gamble, a prescription of grit to cure fragility. The chosen arena for this transformation was athletics, specifically baseball, and most significantly, boxing. His father began taking him to the local YMCA, a place far removed from the quiet sick room he had known. The gym was a world of visceral sensations, the pungent smell of sweat and leather, the rhythmic thud of gloves against heavy bags, the sharp crack of skipping ropes on the wooden floor, the grunts of exertion. It was a gritty, sweat-soaked cathedral of physical effort, and it was here that a profound transformation began. The frail, bookish boy who had lived in fear of his own heartbeat was now being taught to face physical confrontation head-on. He learned the brutal ballet of the ring, how to stand, how to move, how to protect himself. He learned how to take a punch, to feel the jarring impact and the sting of pain, and crucially, to not let it defeat him. He learned how to channel his energy and frustration into a controlled explosion of force, how to throw a punch with his whole body. The training was arduous, pushing him past limits he never knew he had. Every grueling session was a small victory against the illness that had held him captive. He was no longer a passive victim of his body's weakness. He was actively forging his own strength. This training culminated in his entry into the Diamond Gloves amateur boxing competition, a precursor to the more famous Golden Gloves tournament. Competing as a welterweight, he stepped through the ropes into the bright, lonely circle of the ring. By his own later admission, he was not a natural. He wasn't the fastest or the most powerful fighter. He fought with a kind of desperate intelligence, relying on the sheer grit and determination that had been instilled in him. He understood that a fight was not just about physical prowess, it was about will. He compiled a respectable, if not stellar, record of 1 win and 1 loss. But the numbers on the record didn't matter. What mattered were the lessons learned in the crucible of competition. He had learned that he could fight his way back from weakness. He had stared down fear and discovered a reservoir of toughness within himself. The experience hardened him, physically and mentally. It chiseled away the fragility of his youth, revealing the sharp, resilient angles of the man he would become. This wasn't just a hobby. It was the birth of a lifelong philosophy. Life, in all its forms, was a fight, and Roy Scheider would never again back down from one. This fighting spirit, however, was coupled with the sharp, inquisitive mind that had been honed during his years of illness. After graduating from Columbia High School in Maplewood, a prosperous suburb where his academic talents flourished, he was faced with the path of his future. He attended Rutgers University before transferring to Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a prestigious and academically rigorous liberal arts school. He was no longer in the ring, he was in the library, He chose to major in history, drawn to the grand, sweeping narratives of the past, the complex motivations of great figures, and the intricate webs of cause and effect that shaped civilizations. He was on a conventional path to success, one that promised stability, respectability, and financial security. He intended to go to law school, a profession that would satisfy his intellectual curiosity and meet the expectations of his practical, working-class family. It was a world away from the precariousness of his early health scares and the gritty physicality of the boxing gym. But a different kind of stage was calling to him, a different kind of performance. He had dabbled in drama during his college years and discovered something in the act of inhabitation that captivated him. It was a challenge that was both intellectual and physical, a discipline that required the analytical mind of a historian and the emotional availability of an artist. The law was about interpreting the facts of the past. Acting was about embodying its truth. The pull was irresistible. Upon graduating, he made a decision that must have seemed bewildering, even irresponsible to his family. He turned away from the clear, safe path of law school and instead, in 1955, enlisted in the United States Air Force. For 3 years, from 1955 to 1958, he served his country as an officer, rising to the rank of first lieutenant. The military was, in many ways, a natural fit for the disciplined young man forged in the boxing gym. It further honed the sense of order, precision, and respect for hierarchy that would later make him such a consummate professional on chaotic film sets. He was assigned to work in air traffic control, one of the most mentally demanding and high-stakes jobs in the armed forces. In an era before advanced computer assistance, he was responsible for guiding powerful aircraft through the skies, a constant, three-dimensional chess game where a single moment of lapsed focus could have catastrophic consequences. The job demanded absolute precision, unwavering calm under pressure, and an unblinking focus that he would later bring to his most intense character roles. Yet even within the rigid structure of the Air Force, the creative spark flickered and refused to be extinguished. He found an outlet, a way to feed the part of his soul that history books and flight paths couldn't reach. He began organizing and participating in amateur theater productions for his fellow servicemen, bringing the works of great playwrights to makeshift stages on military bases. In these productions, he found his true calling. The camaraderie, the creative problem-solving, and the thrill of performance clarified his life's ambition. When his tour of duty ended in 1958, the path was finally, irrevocably clear. He would not be returning to Pennsylvania to study torts and contracts. He packed his bags, took the discipline of a soldier and the heart of a fighter, and headed for the daunting, vibrant, and fiercely competitive world of New York City. He was going to be an actor. With the discipline of a soldier forged in the rigid structure of the Air Force and the tenacity of a fighter hardened in the boxing ring, Roy Scheider turned his back on a stable, conventional future. His decision to pursue acting in New York was a definitive leap into the unknown, armed with little more than raw talent and an unwavering resolve. But the fight for survival in the amateur boxing circuit and the pressures of military service would pale in comparison to the new battle awaiting him. He was entering the fiercely competitive, emotionally raw world of New York theater in an era defined by the psychological fireworks of the method, a style for which his grounded, stoic demeanor seemed entirely unsuited. The question was no longer if he could take a punch, but whether his unique brand of quiet integrity could find a voice in the loudest city in the world. When Roy Scheider arrived in New York City in 1958, he stepped into a world crackling with artistic revolution. The city was the undisputed epicenter of American theater, a crucible where new ideas and new kinds of actors were being forged. The old guard of polished declamatory stage performers was being overthrown by a new, raw, and psychologically immersive style of acting that had erupted from the classrooms of Lee Strasberg, Stella Adler, and Sanford Meisner. This was the era of the method, a philosophy that demanded actors draw upon their own emotional memories to achieve a visceral, often volatile truthfulness on stage. The avatars of this movement, Marlon Brando and James Dean, had already become cultural icons, their brooding rebelliousness and mumbled naturalism captivating a generation and forever changing the definition of a leading man. The air was thick with ambition, with the scent of cigarettes and coffee in late-night diners where actors argued passionately about motivation and subtext. Into this tempest of raw nerves and emotional fireworks walked First Lieutenant Roy Scheider, recently honorably discharged from the United States Air Force. He did not fit the mold. At 26, he possessed a quiet intensity, but it was the contained intensity of a boxer, not the explosive angst of a method rebel. His demeanor was one of discipline and professionalism, honed by years as an air traffic controller, where composure was a matter of life and death. He had a boxer's build, lean, strong, and purposeful, and a face that was more interesting than handsome, with sharp angles and intelligent, watchful eyes. He wasn't the type to throw a chair in an acting class to access his rage. He was the type to analyze the script, learn his lines, and hit his mark every single time. This grounded, almost stoic presence set him apart from the prevailing trends, and in the fiercely competitive world of New York theater, being different was both a potential asset and a significant hurdle. His first years were a masterclass in the grueling reality of the aspiring actor. The romantic notion of being discovered was a myth. The reality was a relentless, soul-testing grind. He lived the life of 1,000 other hopefuls, navigating a labyrinth of auditions, rejections, and fleeting moments of encouragement. He took on a string of odd jobs to survive, the kind that offered the flexibility to run to a last-minute audition at a moment's notice. He worked as a waiter, balancing trays and enduring the condescension of patrons, all while running lines in his head. He drove a cab, learning the city's intricate geography street by street. He lived in a series of cheap apartments in less than glamorous neighborhoods, the kind with thin walls and the constant hum of the city as a roommate. Each day was a hustle, a fight for a foothold on the lowest rung of a very tall ladder. Rejection was a constant companion, a dull ache that could easily curdle into despair. But the same tenacity that had pushed him out of a sickbed and into a boxing ring now fueled his pursuit of this new, seemingly impossible dream. He treated acting not as a flight of fancy, but as a trade to be learned and mastered through sheer, dogged persistence. He dedicated himself to his craft with the discipline of a soldier. He studied, he watched, he worked. He found his place not in the emotionally indulgent workshops of the method purists, but in the more structured and classical training environments. His dedication and undeniable talent eventually earned him a coveted spot in the prestigious Lincoln Center Repertory Company. This was a significant step up from the obscurity of off-Broadway showcases. The company was one of the nation's premier theatrical institutions, committed to producing a rotating slate of classic and contemporary plays. Here, he was no longer just another anonymous face in a cattle call audition. He was a company member, a professional actor earning a steady, if modest, wage for his art. He worked alongside a remarkable generation of talent, a cohort of actors who would go on to define American cinema for the next 2 decades. His colleagues included a young, fiercely ambitious Dustin Hoffman and a stunning, enigmatic actress named Faye Dunaway. In this vibrant, competitive, and collaborative environment, Scheider honed his skills. He immersed himself in the works of the masters, Shakespeare, Chekhov, Ibsen, learning the mechanics of classical performance. Unlike the raw immediacy of film, the stage demanded immense vocal control, physical precision, and the stamina to deliver a powerful performance 8 times a week. It was a discipline that suited his nature perfectly. He wasn't the flashiest actor in the company, but he quickly earned a reputation for being one of the most reliable and intelligent. Directors knew that Roy Scheider would always be prepared, that he would understand the architecture of a scene, and that he would bring a grounded, believable humanity to any role he inhabited. After years of tireless work on the stage, his breakthrough came in 1968. He was cast in a challenging off-Broadway production called Stephen D., a dramatic adaptation of James Joyce's semi-autobiographical novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. For his powerful and nuanced performance, Roy Scheider won a coveted Obie Award. In the landscape of New York theater, the Obie is a mark of profound distinction, a recognition of artistic excellence bestowed by the community itself. It was the ultimate validation. After a decade of struggle, he had been recognized by his peers as a serious, significant talent. The award didn't make him a household name, but it gave him something more valuable: credibility. He had proven his mettle in the most demanding arena of them all. While the stage was fulfilling, it had its limits in terms of reach and financial security. The silver screen offered a different kind of immortality and a broader canvas. His film debut had come a few years earlier in a low-budget 1964 horror film titled The Curse of the Living Corpse. It was a forgettable start to what would become an unforgettable career, a schlocky B-movie that he likely took for the paycheck and the experience. For several years, his film work continued in this vein. He took small parts, playing anonymous thugs, world-weary cops, and assorted tough guys. He was a reliable character actor, the kind of face you recognized from a dozen different movies but couldn't quite name. Then, in 1971, everything changed. Director William Friedkin, a brash and brilliant filmmaker at the forefront of the burgeoning New Hollywood movement, was casting a gritty, realistic police thriller based on a true story. The film was The French Connection. New Hollywood was a rejection of the glossy, studio-bound productions of the past. It was a cinema of the streets, inspired by the French New Wave, that favored location shooting, moral ambiguity, and a documentary-style realism. Friedkin was looking for authenticity above all else. He wanted actors who looked, sounded, and felt like real New York City cops, not movie stars pretending to be cops. He cast Gene Hackman, another journeyman character actor, as the obsessive, abrasive, and deeply flawed detective Jimmy Popeye Doyle. For Popeye's more grounded, weary, and intelligent partner, Buddy Cloudy Russo, Friedkin needed an anchor. He needed someone who could project stability and a quiet competence next to Hackman's manic, explosive energy. He found that quality in Roy Scheider. Friedkin saw in him not just an actor, but the embodiment of the professional blue-collar detective, smart, tough, and fundamentally decent, but worn down by the filth he waded through every day. The French Connection was a game-changer, not just for Scheider, but for American cinema. Shot on the frozen, garbage-strewn streets of New York in the dead of winter, the film had a raw, visceral energy that audiences had never seen before. Its legendary car chase sequence was a masterpiece of kinetic, death-defying filmmaking that set a new standard for action. The dynamic between Hackman's Popeye and Scheider's Cloudy was the heart of the film. While Popeye was the brilliant, out-of-control force of nature, Cloudy was the steadying hand, the one who tried to keep his partner tethered to reality. Scheider's performance was a masterclass in subtlety. He conveyed Cloudy's intelligence, his loyalty, and his growing exasperation with Popeye's methods through small, perfectly observed gestures and a palpable sense of weariness. The film was a massive critical and commercial success, winning 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director for Friedkin, and Best Actor for Hackman. Scheider's crucial contribution did not go unnoticed. He was nominated for Best Supporting Actor. At the age of 39, after more than a decade of grinding it out on stage and in bit parts, Roy Scheider had finally arrived. The Oscar nomination was a key that unlocked every door in Hollywood. He was no longer a struggling unknown. He was an acclaimed, in-demand actor. He immediately capitalized on his newfound status, delivering a chilling performance as a mysterious and menacing pimp in the paranoid thriller Klute, starring opposite Jane Fonda. He proved he could be just as compelling playing a character on the other side of the law. But his success came with a new, gilded cage, typecasting. With his sharp features, athletic build, and no-nonsense air, he was Hollywood's new go-to guy for cops, detectives, government agents, and assorted authority figures. He was good at it, incredibly good. He brought a level of gravitas and realism to these roles that few could match. But he was an artist, not a caricature. He was the man who had won an Obie for interpreting James Joyce, who had mastered Shakespeare. He yearned for roles that would challenge him, that would allow him to explore the deeper, more complex and vulnerable corners of the human experience. He had no idea that the role that would make him a global superstar, the one that would etch his face into the collective consciousness forever, would also be the one to trap him most completely. In the mid-1970s, a young, prodigiously talented director named Steven Spielberg, fresh off the critical success of his road movie The Sugarland Express, was preparing to adapt Peter Benchley's best-selling novel about a great white shark terrorizing a New England beach town. The film was called Jaws. For the central role of the beleaguered police chief, Martin Brody, Spielberg needed an everyman. He didn't want a chiseled action hero like Charlton Heston, who had expressed interest in the part. He needed a relatable, grounded family man who is completely out of his element, a New York cop who, in a perfect stroke of irony, is terrified of the water. Spielberg had seen Scheider's weary, principled performance in The French Connection and knew he had found his chief Brody. He saw in Scheider the exact combination of quiet authority and underlying vulnerability that the character required. Roy Scheider, the actor who fought to be seen as more than just a cop, was about to become the most famous cop in the world, facing a foe far more monstrous than any drug kingpin on the streets of New York. The Oscar nomination for The French Connection was the validation Roy Scheider had spent over a decade fighting for. He was no longer an anonymous journeyman, but a respected and in-demand actor who had proven his mettle. Yet, as he stood at the precipice of global stardom with the offer to play Chief Brody in Jaws, he faced a new and more insidious kind of fight. The battle was no longer for recognition, but for his very artistic identity. The success promised by the film was a double-edged sword, threatening to trap him forever in the heroic, everyman persona he had just begun to transcend. The wave of fame that was about to hit him would be larger and more powerful than any shark, forcing him into a decade-long struggle against the gilded cage of his own success and prompting the greatest artistic gambles of his career. The release of Jaws in the summer of 1975 was not merely a success, it was a seismic cultural event that fundamentally and permanently altered the landscape of the film industry. The film didn't just break box office records, it vaporized them, becoming the first movie in history to gross over $100 million and creating the template for the modern summer blockbuster. For Roy Scheider, the experience was transformative and deeply paradoxical. The journey to this career pinnacle had been, quite literally, a trial by water. The production of Jaws is now the stuff of Hollywood legend, a case study in Murphy's Law where anything that could go wrong did. Filmed on location in the unpredictable waters off Martha's Vineyard, the production was a logistical catastrophe. The schedule ballooned from a planned 55 days to an excruciating 159. The budget skyrocketed. The notoriously unreliable mechanical shark, nicknamed Bruce by the crew after Spielberg's lawyer, rarely worked, spending most of its time corroding on the ocean floor. The cast and crew were stranded for months, battling the elements, seasickness, and their own mounting frustrations. On the deck of the Orca, a fascinating and volatile dynamic developed between the three leads. Robert Shaw, the formidable, classically trained British actor cast as the grizzled shark hunter Quint, was as tempestuous and unpredictable as the sea itself. His legendary drinking habit fueling a brilliant but often difficult on-set persona. Richard Dreyfuss, playing the cocky young oceanographer Matt Hooper, was bursting with a nervous, ambitious energy that often grated on the older, more experienced Shaw. The two famously clashed, their personalities and acting styles colliding like tectonic plates, their off-screen animosity fueling their characters' on-screen friction. And in the middle of this maelstrom was Roy Scheider, the professional, the anchor. While Shaw and Dreyfuss engaged in theatrical feuds and psychological gamesmanship, Scheider was the steadying force, the calm center of the storm. He was the mediator, the quiet diplomat who kept the lines of communication from snapping entirely. He arrived on set every day fully prepared, knew his lines and everyone else's, and did his job with the quiet, unshowy discipline of a man who had earned his place through hard work, not theatrics. He was the ex-Air Force officer who understood the mission, the boxer who knew how to absorb a blow and stay focused. His character, Chief Brody, became the soul of the film, precisely because Scheider himself was its anchor in real life. Brody was the audience's surrogate, a decent, relatable man defined by his quiet determination, and Scheider embodied that decency both on and off the screen. In one unscripted moment of brilliance, Scheider captured the essence of his character and created cinematic history. During the filming of a scene where Brody is begrudgingly chumming the water, the massive shark appears for the first time, its true scale revealed in a heart-stopping instant. Startled, Scheider's Brody stumbles backward into the boat's cabin, his face a mask of disbelief. He looks at Shaw's Quint and says, with a deadpan sense of shock that was utterly authentic, "You're going to need a bigger boat." The line was not in Peter Benchley's novel or the original script. It was an ad lib, a piece of spontaneous genius that Scheider had picked up from the crew, who often joked about the production's undersized support vessels. In that moment, he perfectly channeled the audience's collective gasp into 4 unforgettable words. The tidal wave of fame that Jaws created was immense. Roy Scheider was no longer just a respected Oscar-nominated actor. He was a household name, the hero who faced down the shark. The role gave him financial security for life and the industry clout to choose his own projects, the very definition of success in Hollywood. Yet this success was a double-edged sword. It cemented his image as Chief Brody in the public imagination with an indelible finality. For the rest of his life, he would be the man from Amity Island. It was a role he was immensely proud of, but it was also a beautifully crafted box, and he would spend the rest of his most artistically vital years fighting to escape it. In the immediate wake of Jaws, Scheider found himself at a critical crossroads. He was an international star, but he was also a serious artist, wary of being confined by his own success. He made a conscious and deliberate decision to leverage his newfound power to pursue roles that were difficult, unconventional, and as far away from the heroic everyman of Chief Brody as he could get. He wanted to remind the world, and perhaps himself, that he was a versatile, classically trained actor, not just a blockbuster hero. His first major post-Jaws statement was in John Schlesinger's tense 1976 thriller, Marathon Man. He played Henry Doc Levy, the enigmatic older brother of Dustin Hoffman's protagonist. Doc is a secret government agent, a courier, operating in a shadowy world of international espionage. Scheider's portrayal was the antithesis of the flustered Chief Brody. He was cool, confident, and lethally competent, projecting a sleek, dangerous intensity that was a world away from Amity Island. Though his screen time was limited, his presence was powerful and haunting. The film was a critical and commercial success, proving he could hold his own with acting titans like Hoffman and Sir Laurence Olivier, and it served as a clear signal of his artistic intentions. But it was his next project that would represent the biggest, boldest, and most dangerous gamble of his career. William Friedkin, the mercurial director who had given him his break in The French Connection, approached him with a script for a film called Sorcerer. It was a remake of the classic 1953 French thriller The Wages of Fear, a grim, existentialist story about four desperate men from different corners of the globe, all hiding from their pasts in a squalid South American village. They are hired for a suicide mission to transport a volatile shipment of aging, sweating nitroglycerin over 200 miles of treacherous jungle terrain. Scheider was cast as Jackie Scanlon, a driver for the Irish mob in New York who is now in hiding after a violent heist. He is not a hero, he is a desperate man running for his life. The production was even more hellish and technically ambitious than Jaws. Friedkin, obsessed with realism, eschewed studio backlots for the unforgiving jungles of the Dominican Republic. The cast and crew were plagued by disease, venomous insects, and logistical nightmares. The director's tyrannical pursuit of authenticity pushed everyone to their absolute limits. In the film's most harrowing sequence, the men must drive their heavy trucks, laden with explosives, across a rickety rope bridge during a torrential downpour. Friedkin, refusing to use miniatures or special effects, had a full-scale, multi-ton hydraulic bridge built over a real river. He used massive pumps to simulate the storm, battering the actors and vehicles for weeks. The sequence was incredibly dangerous. The terror on Roy Scheider's face in the finished film is not acting. He later stated, without hyperbole, that making Sorcerer was the single most difficult and physically grueling experience of his professional life. He poured everything he had into the role and the film. He believed they were creating a masterpiece, a gritty, uncompromising epic that would redefine the action genre. It was art, pure and simple. Sorcerer was finally released in the summer of 1977, just 1 week after a small, optimistic science fiction film called Star Wars opened in theaters and changed the world. Friedkin's dark, nihilistic, and relentlessly bleak vision was completely out of step with the cultural mood. Audiences, captivated by the heroic space opera of George Lucas, had no appetite for a story about four doomed men in a muddy jungle. Sorcerer was a catastrophic box office bomb, a failure of spectacular proportions that deeply wounded both Scheider and Friedkin. For Scheider, it was a bitter and profound lesson in the unpredictable whims of Hollywood. He had taken his Jaws capital and bet it all on art, and the market had rejected it in the most brutal way imaginable. His next major choice, however, would lead him from his greatest commercial failure to the greatest artistic triumph of his career. The legendary director and choreographer Bob Fosse was preparing to make a deeply personal, semi-autobiographical film about his own life. It was a hallucinatory, no-holds-barred look at a brilliant, womanizing, pill-popping, chain-smoking theater director named Joe Gideon, who was driving himself to an early grave in the pursuit of perfection. The character was a thinly veiled portrait of Fosse himself, a man whose genius was inextricably linked to his self-destructive impulses. The film, titled All That Jazz, would be a raw, unflinching examination of the brutal cost of creativity. The role of Joe Gideon was a killer, both physically and emotionally. It required an actor of immense discipline, charisma, and a fearless willingness to explore the darkest, most narcissistic corners of the human psyche. More than that, Fosse needed someone who could dance, who had the stage training to understand Joe Gideon's world, and who possessed the raw physicality to convincingly portray a man literally working himself to death. He needed Roy Scheider. Released in 1979, All That Jazz was a dazzling, audacious, and deeply unsettling musical masterpiece. Scheider, in the role of his life, was an absolute revelation. He disappeared completely into the character, capturing all of Joe Gideon's glaring contradictions, the artistic brilliance and the personal chaos, the irresistible charm and the casual cruelty, the desperate love for life and the nonchalant flirtation with death, personified by Jessica Lange's angelic Angelique. The film's famous opening sequence, a massive cattle call audition set to George Benson's On Broadway, is a masterclass in physical acting, with Scheider as the demanding, all-seeing, chain-smoking puppet master. He wasn't just playing a character, he was channeling the tormented soul of a great artist. He learned Fosse's intricate angular choreography, adopted his signature hunched posture and mannerisms, and smoked constantly on and off screen. It was a complete and total immersion, a performance of breathtaking virtuosity and vulnerability. The performance earned him his second Academy Award nomination, this time for Best Actor. He was up against his old Lincoln Center colleague Dustin Hoffman for Kramer vs. Kramer. While Hoffman ultimately took home the statue, Scheider's work in All That Jazz is widely considered to be the pinnacle of his career and one of the great screen performances of the decade. It was the ultimate validation of his talent and his risky choices. He had taken a gamble on Sorcerer and lost, but he had taken an even bigger one on All That Jazz and, artistically, had won everything. He had finally, definitively, escaped the shadow of the shark. But the 1980s proved to be a more challenging and frustrating decade. After the artistic high of All That Jazz, Scheider found himself in a strange professional limbo. Now in his 50s, he was too old for the young action hero roles that were becoming popular in the era of Stallone and Schwarzenegger, and his distinctive, intelligent presence made him a difficult fit for generic leading man parts. He worked steadily, starring in a series of solid, well-made, but less inspired films. He played a renegade helicopter pilot in the action thriller Blue Thunder, 1983, and reprised his role as Dr. Haywood Floyd in the respectable sci-fi sequel 2010, The Year We Make Contact, 1984. He even reluctantly returned to the water for Jaws 2, 1978, a film he did solely to fulfill a 3-picture contractual obligation to Universal Studios after he had dropped out of The Deer Hunter, a film that would go on to win Best Picture. He openly despised the sequel, feeling it was a cynical cash grab that cheapened the legacy of the original masterpiece. His contempt for the project was an open secret, but his professionalism ensured he delivered a committed performance, even if his heart wasn't in it. During this period, there was a palpable sense of quiet frustration. He was a respected veteran, a consummate professional by every measure, but the truly great roles, the ones that set his soul on fire like Joe Gideon had, were becoming harder and harder to find. As the 1990s dawned, a new medium with a grueling schedule and a different kind of stardom would offer him a new challenge, and a role that would unexpectedly cast him as a mentor to a new generation. After the artistic pinnacle of All That Jazz and the subsequent frustrating decade of solid but less inspired work, Roy Scheider entered the 1990s as a respected elder statesman of his craft. He had fought the studio system, battled typecasting, and carved out a legacy of undeniable integrity. But as the cinematic landscape shifted around him, the great soul-defining roles became harder to find. A new stage was required for the final act of his career, and he found it in the burgeoning world of high-concept television. This move would cast him in a new and unexpected role, not of the rebel artist, but of the wise mentor. It would also lead him toward the most personal and profound struggles of his life, where the opponent was not a studio or a script, but the fragility of life itself, forcing him to confront his own mortality and his legacy as a fighter to the very end. As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, Roy Scheider, now approaching his 60s, found himself navigating the quieter waters of a veteran actor's career. The blistering intensity of his work in the 70s had given way to a steady stream of respectable, if less groundbreaking, roles. Then, an ambitious and unexpected project emerged from the very man who had launched him into the stratosphere of stardom 2 decades earlier. Steven Spielberg, now a titan of the industry, was lending his name and creative force as an executive producer to a high-concept science fiction series for NBC. Billed as an optimistic, family-friendly, underwater Star Trek, the show was called SeaQuest DSV. Set in the near future of 2018, it would follow the crew of the world's most advanced submarine, a colossal vessel conducting scientific research and serving as a global peacekeeping force in a world where humanity's last frontier was the ocean. For the crucial role of the vessel's wise and reluctant commander, Captain Nathan Bridger, the producers needed an actor who radiated gravitas, intelligence, and a familiar, trustworthy authority. They needed an anchor. They needed Roy Scheider. Initially, Scheider was hesitant. Committing to a network television series meant a grueling, all-consuming schedule of long days on set, a far cry from the more contained schedule of a feature film. It would mean relocating for months at a time, away from his family and his beloved home in Sag Harbor, Long Island. But the premise was intriguing. The budget was enormous, and the involvement of Spielberg was a powerful lure. He signed on, becoming the unquestionable center of the show, both on-screen and off. As Captain Bridger, he was the moral compass, a brilliant but world-weary scientist coaxed out of a self-imposed retirement to command the magnificent submarine he had helped design. The role was a perfect fit, a culmination of the principled, intelligent, and deeply decent characters he had so often portrayed. The cast was a mix of seasoned character actors and a crop of fresh-faced young talent hoping for their big break. Among them was a 17-year-old actor who was already a phenomenon. His name was Jonathan Brandis. With a shock of blonde hair, a brilliant smile, and an intense, soulful intelligence in his eyes, Brandis was a bona fide teen idol, his face plastered on the covers of magazines like Tiger Beat and Bop. He was cast as Lucas Wolinchak, a teenage computer genius and scientific prodigy who, through a series of events, finds a home and a purpose aboard the SeaQuest. He was positioned as the show's youthful heart, the audience's window into this futuristic world, and the protégé to Scheider's Captain Bridger. From the very beginning of production, a special and genuine bond formed between the veteran actor and the young star. Scheider, then in his early 60s, saw in Brandis a reflection of the passion, intelligence, and dedication he himself had possessed as a young man starting out in the unforgiving world of New York theater. He recognized a serious artist beneath the glossy veneer of teen stardom. Brandis, in turn, looked up to Scheider with a kind of reverent awe. Here was Chief Brody, Joe Gideon, a living legend from a golden age of cinema, and he was treating him not as a kid or a teen heartthrob, but as a professional peer. On set, they were often inseparable. Scheider, the consummate professional, took it upon himself to mentor the younger actor, to guide him through the unique pressures of headlining a major network show. He would run lines with Brandis, offering insights into character and motivation. He would share stories from his long and storied career, tales of working with Fosse and Friedkin, of the chaos on the set of Jaws, imparting not just acting techniques, but lessons in survival and integrity in a notoriously difficult industry. For Brandis, who had been acting since he was a small child, this was invaluable. The world of a teen idol is a treacherous one, a funhouse mirror of fleeting adoration and intense scrutiny, often populated by sycophants and handlers. Scheider was something different. He was a rock. He was a craftsman who respected the work above all else, a link to a more serious and grounded tradition of acting. Their on-screen relationship as the wise mentor and the brilliant student mirrored their real-life dynamic. Captain Bridger saw the immense potential in Lucas Wollensak, and Roy Scheider saw the immense potential in Jonathan Brandis. He became, by all accounts, the most significant and stable adult mentor Brandis had in his professional life. SeaQuest DSV premiered in the fall of 1993 to huge ratings and massive hype. It was an instant hit, and Brandis's star, already bright, soared into the stratosphere. He received thousands of fan letters a week, his fame reaching a fever pitch. Scheider watched this explosion with a wary, protective eye. He understood the dangers of that kind of intense early success, how it could warp a young person's sense of self and set them up for a brutal fall. He tried to keep Brandis focused on the craft, on the long game, on the work itself rather than the temporary insanity of teen stardom. But behind the scenes, trouble was brewing. By the second season, network executives, chasing ratings, began to meddle heavily with the show's creative direction. They pushed for more outlandish science fiction-heavy plots, moving away from the more plausible science-based stories that had initially attracted Scheider. The quality in his eyes began to plummet. He was a serious actor, an Obie winner, a two-time Oscar nominee, and he found himself acting opposite talking dolphins and dealing with storylines about ancient aliens and killer sea monsters. His frustration grew into disillusionment. He felt the show was betraying its original promise, becoming a caricature of itself. In a moment of pure, unvarnished Roy Scheider integrity, his frustration became public. In a candid interview, he famously derided the show's new direction, calling it childish trash and expressing his deep disappointment. For the star of a show to publicly trash his own product was, and still is, a shocking breach of industry etiquette. But it was the act of the boxer who refused to pull a punch, the artist who refused to dishonor his own work with false praise. If he didn't believe in something, he would not pretend to. At the end of the second season, he had had enough. He negotiated his exit from the show, agreeing to make a few guest appearances in the third season to wrap up his character's arc before a new captain, played by Michael Ironside, was brought in. His departure was the death knell for the series. Without its anchor, SeaQuest, renamed SeaQuest 2032 for its final season, drifted aimlessly and was quickly canceled. For the cast and crew, the loss of Scheider was profound, but for Jonathan Brandis, it was a seismic event. The mentor, the steadying hand, the one person who had provided guidance and a model of integrity amidst the surreal circus of fame, was gone. Brandis was left to navigate the treacherous post-teen idol years largely on his own. The industry that had built him up so quickly began to move on. The phone stopped ringing as often. The transition was brutal, a common but cruel fate for those who achieve massive fame at a young age. Scheider, meanwhile, returned to a quieter, more deliberate life. He went back to his beloved home in Sag Harbor, a charming and historic whaling town on the eastern end of Long Island. He had moved there with his second wife, Brenda Seymour, and their children, and had fallen deeply in love with the community's sense of history and close-knit nature. He became a passionate local activist, a fierce defender of his adopted hometown. When developers threatened to build massive retail stores that would destroy the town's character, or when the local hospital was in danger of closing, Roy Scheider was on the front lines. He organized protests, attended town hall meetings, and used his celebrity to draw attention to local causes. He was no longer just playing the decent, principled community leader. He was living it, fighting for his neighbors with the same conviction he brought to a film set. He continued to work in independent films and television, taking on roles that interested him, free from the pressures of stardom. He was a character actor again, just as he had been at the start of his career, and he seemed content. But a new fight was on the horizon, one that would require all the strength and tenacity he had cultivated over a lifetime. In 2004, Roy Scheider received a devastating diagnosis. He had multiple myeloma, a rare and incurable cancer of the plasma cells in the bone marrow. It is a cruel, insidious disease that weakens the bones, damages the kidneys, and compromises the immune system. For the man who had built his entire identity on physical strength and resilience, from the boxing ring to the grueling film sets of Jaws and Sorcerer, it was a terrifying blow. But he faced his diagnosis with the same pragmatic grit he had brought to every other challenge in his life. He refused to be a passive victim. He educated himself about the disease, sought out the best doctors, and underwent grueling treatments including chemotherapy and a bone marrow transplant in 2005. The transplant was a brutal, physically depleting procedure, but for a time it brought him into remission. He became a public advocate for cancer research, lending his voice and his story to help raise awareness and funds, fighting not just for himself, but for the thousands of others battling the same disease. This intensely private and difficult battle was unfolding in the shadow of a terrible tragedy that had struck the extended family of SeaQuest. On November 12, 2003, just a year before Scheider's own diagnosis, Jonathan Brandis was found dead in his Los Angeles apartment. He had taken his own life. He was only 27 years old. The news was a profound shock. Friends reported that he had been deeply depressed about his faltering career and the painful transition from teen idol to working adult actor. The bright, promising star that Scheider had mentored and guided had been consumed by the very darkness he had tried to help him navigate. There is no public record of Scheider's specific reaction to Brandis's death, as he was a fiercely private man when it came to personal grief. But one can only imagine the profound sorrow he must have felt. It was a tragic, heartbreaking coda to their time together, a stark reminder of the fragility of life in an industry that so often builds up and then discards its young. Now Scheider was fighting his own battle for life. For several years after his transplant, he lived with the cancer, managing it as a chronic condition. But by late 2007, his health took a sharp decline. The cancer had returned, and it was aggressive. He was admitted to the hospital, weakened not just by the disease, but by a staph infection his compromised immune system could not repel. On February 10, 2008, with his wife Brenda by his side, Roy Scheider died at the University of Arkansas Medical Sciences Hospital. He was 75 years old. The news of his death prompted an outpouring of tributes. He was remembered as a consummate professional, a brilliant actor, and a man of unwavering integrity. But to truly understand Roy Scheider's legacy is to look beyond the iconic roles. His life was a testament to the quiet power of endurance. He was a man who was constantly fighting against childhood illness, against typecasting, against artistic compromise, and finally, against the cells in his own body. He was a central figure in the new Hollywood movement, an actor who helped redefine the American screen hero not as a superhero or a flawless icon, but as a relatable human being, flawed and frightened but ultimately decent and resolute. Perhaps his most poignant legacy, however, is the one least discussed, that of the mentor. In the story of Roy Scheider and Jonathan Brandis, we see the beautiful and heartbreaking reality of human connection. For a brief, shining moment, a seasoned veteran offered a guiding hand to a young man on the verge of being swept away. His death was the final chapter in that story. The mentor, the rock, the man who had faced down a great white shark and stared into the abyss of his own mortality on screen, was himself mortal. He fought his final battle with a courage that defined his entire life, leaving behind a body of work that speaks to his immense talent and the lingering melancholic memory of a bright young star who lost his way after his anchor was gone. In the end, Roy Scheider was so much more than the man who needed a bigger boat. He was the quiet boy who found his strength in the boxing ring, the disciplined officer who found his passion on the stage, the artist who fought for his vision, and the citizen who fought for his community. He was a man of substance in a world of surfaces, a fighter to the very end. And in his story we find a powerful, enduring truth that the measure of a life is not in a single iconic moment, but in the courage and integrity with which we face all the moments that follow.